Now, here's an amazing fact. 10 days in a hospital bed equates to 10 years of muscle aging. Isn't that amazing? It's a fact of life that as we age, we get weaker. From our 40s onwards, we gradually begin to lose our muscles. By our 60s, the process radically speeds up. However, here is the thing. If you go into hospital and you're in bed for just a fortnight, the muscles can waste so severely that you may struggle to lead a normal daily life. Again, you could lose your independence altogether if you're older. Because muscles, of course, allow us to move, pick things up, balance, and they protect our bones if we fall over. Not only is it crucial to keep them in good order as we age, which is very obvious, it's also vital to keep moving if we ever end up in hospital or bedbound. That's what we're talking about now. Once you're in a hospital bed, the process of wastage is frighteningly fast. If you can just keep moving when you're ill, you can possibly set yourself up for a faster recovery. Now, joining us first, Sarah Jarvis is here, of course, is Karen Rogers. Karen is part of a campaign called #EndPJparalysis. PJ equals pajamas. So stop people getting, essentially losing movement because they spend all their time in their PJs. And it's such a big thing. The NHS has now begun its own campaign called Get Up, Get Dressed and Get Active, aimed at its patients in hospital. Isn't that amazing? So, Karen, good afternoon.
Oh, good afternoon, Jeremy.
And this is a subject very close to your heart because you run care homes and you see how once people are in bed, they stay in bed.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, pyjama paralysis started, I think the conversation started back in 2016 with Professor Brian Dolan talking about it, and it's just taken on a life of its own. And the campaign EndPJparalysis 70 is celebrating 70 years of the NHS, which is why the NHS have really got behind this campaign. And of course, from a care home perspective, there are around 380,000 people living in care homes in England, which is 3 times the amount of people in care homes than there are in general hospital beds. So it's absolutely important that care homes get behind this campaign also.
And this amazing statistic that if you're in a hospital bed for 10 days, that's the equivalent of 10 years of muscle aging. Oh, go on, Sarah.
That is just if you're over 80.
If you're over 80.
And that's really important because, of course, the problem we have is that it's people who are over 80 and older people generally, but particularly the over 80s, who are at much higher risk of falls, much higher risk of ending up not being able to be independent anymore. And, of course, the problem is it's the law of diminishing returns. You know, the very people who need it most are the ones most likely not to get it.
So pyjamas are the enemy, Karen?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, people are living independently at home, people over 80, people in their 90s, and they're managing to have the muscle strength to climb stairs, to walk to the bathroom. And in care homes, it's exactly the same. People are mobile, even with a small amount of mobility, to have the muscle strength to transfer from their bed to a chair, to have the muscle strength to reach for a drink, and to promote their independence. So something catastrophic can happen, an emergency may happen that results in a hospital admission. And then very, very quickly, sometimes within hours of being in bed, that muscle strength starts to diminish and people become weak. And the longer people are in bed, the weaker they become. And the chance of people ever returning back to their own home or returning to the level of independence they had are greatly reduced. And as you say,
it's counterintuitive, this, because I would have thought you stay in bed to rest and recuperate, and then you get better, and then you get out of bed as a person who is well again. But you're almost turning it around.
Well, I think if there's a clinical or a medical reason to be in bed, it's absolutely the right place to be. But quite often you're treated for a particular clinical condition and you've recovered from that. But for various other reasons, people are remaining in bed in hospitals and in care homes when in fact they don't need to be. They need to be out of their pyjamas, in their own clothes, up, active, moving, and on the road to recovery back home.
It's interesting, Karen. I wonder, from your perspective, why is it that as doctors we've moved so far towards saying once you've had a hip replacement, once you've had a knee replacement, we should be getting you up and about the same day? Is it just because we worried about deep vein thrombosis there? Because, in fact, people who are bedbound are also at risk of deep vein thrombosis if they haven't had an operation.
Yeah, absolutely. I think we are quite risk averse, and I think there's a lot of reasons that people stay in bed. There's a fear of falling. There's also issues like staffing levels that impact on hospitals and care homes. But yeah, I think we're quite risk averse, and certainly from a care home perspective, our sort of secret weapon, without doubt, is having therapy. Having therapists that work with people every day to keep people moving, to maintain their independence, and just to keep that muscle strength, core stability, and enable people to continue to leave a good, active life and making value of people's time.
And the NHS campaign, which sounds almost as if they copied some of your thoughts, is called Get Up, Get Dressed, Get Active. And that was in the papers a few weeks ago, Karen, where they've said we want people out of their gowns. Is that right?
Well, actually, the campaign is an NHS campaign, and probably care homes, we have piggybacked onto the back of it, because
Right.
it doesn't matter who it is. It's about people. It's about valuing patient time, residents' time. And the campaign is EndPJparalysis 70. But the campaign was, before it was a campaign, the whole premise of PJ paralysis has been around for a little while now.
Because, Sarah, I suppose when people go to hospital, they think, I am a patient. They put a hospital gown on, the clothes get packed away, and until they leave the hospital, they've got the gown on, and then maybe they do go into a different mindset.
Well, and of course, one of the tragedies is some of those hospital gowns, which, have a great gap at the back. The last thing you want to do is to be shuffling along a corridor with everything hanging out behind you. And I think, that there's been a lot of concern about that sort of thing. That's how people perceive it. But I think it's extraordinary to think that 60%, according to this EndPJparalysis campaign, 60% of immobile people don't have any clinical reason why they need to be in bed. I think Karen's made a very good point about concern, because, of course, the tragedy is that if somebody gets out of bed and has a fall, then the hospital will immediately be sued, whereas if the patient stays in bed, nobody's going to sue.
And you corrected me on the stat about 10 days in bed is 10 years of muscle wastage for an over 80. Okay, let's say the person's 40 and they've come off their motorbike. Does that same kind of thing apply?
Not at nearly the same speed, but the older you are, the more rapidly it happens, and the more rapid the loss. And the particular issue for older people is that it's not just muscle strength, it's balance as well, because muscle power is so important for balance. And the older you are, the more at risk you are of falls for all sorts of reasons, not least because your what we call proprioception, which is your ability to measure what's going on around you and to take cues from what's going on around you in terms of keeping your balance, is not as good as it was.
Des in Harrogate texts, I was in hospital for months some years back. I was very ill, but I could walk. There's only limited space in a ward to walk around, and you easily get in the way of the doctors. I always thought a treadmill somewhere in the hospital that could be booked for just a 10-minute session would be great. Karen, what do you think of that?
Well, I'm not sure really whether that would be the right thing, but certainly people can exercise, they can work with postural stability instructors, physiotherapists, occupational therapists, and even just standing and doing some very simple exercises that improve your core strength are absolutely essential. You don't need a lot of space, but we do need to keep people moving. And even just walking from your bed, from your chair to your bathroom and back, that kind of exercise every day will increase your core strength and the ability to not lose the muscles in your legs.
Didn't they always say, Sarah, that older people should think carefully before they buy a bungalow, because the idea of I don't want to go up and down the stairs, once you decide not to have stairs in your house, you will never be able to use stairs again.
Well, that's absolutely right. And of course, the smaller your world becomes as people get older and they spend a lot of time in one room, then their world shrinks. It's a particular issue we know with people who have things like COPD, where breathlessness stops them getting out. But I think we're also beginning to recognise this is an issue too for people who've had falls, for instance. So what you need to do is to stop the first fall from happening. And to do that, you need not to lose the muscle strength in the first place.
1:15, Radio 2, talking to Dr Sarah Jarvis and also Karen Rogers, whose campaign is called EndPJparalysis. Thank you very much to Karen Rogers, whose campaign is EndPJparalysis, hashtag EndPJparalysis if you want to look that up. And we're just talking, Sarah, aren't we, about just the negative effect of being in a hospital bed. Who would have thought it?
And although it's the 10 years, 10 days, 10 years statistic relates to over 80s, actually we mustn't underestimate how much of an impact it can have on younger people, because younger people kind of take it for granted. And I know that, for instance, when you have a broken leg or something like that and you're in plaster, it comes out and it's kind of all withered and you're like, what's going on here? But actually for somebody who's had, say, sepsis or who's had a road traffic accident, had major surgery, when they're in hospital, a lot of the recovery is not just the recovery from the sepsis, it's not just the recovery from the road traffic accident. Those would be big enough on themselves. But the problem we have is that we then have the recovery from the side effects of that, which is being completely immobile.
So it sort of compounds the initial thing. Yeah. Jill Smullen knows about this. Jill in Loughton, Greater Manchester. Your hubby went into hospital.
Yes, my love.
And he'd had a little accident, had he?
He'd fallen fallen and he'd broken his left ankle, fibula and tibia.
Okay. Is he of an age, may I ask?
He's 72.
So he's a young man, and he was in hospital for how long?
He was in hospital, I would say, from the January until the near December.
Oh, so nearly a year.
I tell a lie. It was the 2nd of February until December.
Good 10 months then.
Gosh.
Yes.
And so was he in bed all that time flat on his back?
No, in the beginning, it was a rehab unit, and he was sent to the hospital because they said that he would benefit by it. And I thought, brilliant, because we used to go a couple of times a week into Lee Hospital for the physio, and then we'd come home. And they said he would benefit by being in the hospital, and I said, fine. In the first few weeks, months maybe, he was fine. And then the physio ended up basically going less and less and less. And they did have him on a tilting table. And he said he felt good like that. And then all of a sudden, they did nothing. And they put him... As you sit down on a chair, your legs are automatically, and your body, it's like in a letter Z. And that's how he stayed in the bed 22 hours a day. And he was up, I would say, maybe an hour, 2 hours a day. Sometimes to go and have a meal. And then it was straight back in bed.
Of course, the big problem that we're getting here, Jill, I'm just sitting here cringing hearing about this, because not only do you then end up losing all this muscle fitness, this so-called deconditioning, and you actually lose the muscle fibres because they're partially replaced with fat, but you also, if you're in the same position, have a hugely increased risk of bed sores, which costs the NHS millions, and that is before we even get started on the human misery involved if you've been sitting or lying in one position for too long. And, of course, you can end up with what's called contractures. So if you're not moving the joints, then they literally seize up and you can't move them. So it gets to the stage where, because you haven't moved them, now you can't move them, and now you can't get better.
Oof. And did you say it was an ankle, Jill?
Yes, his left ankle. It was fibula and tibia.
Because I would have thought you could move, Sarah, you can move still quite a lot of your body despite the ankle.
When he broke his ankle, he ended up going to the hospital, and they diagnosed that he had broken his fibula and tibia.
Yeah.
They put a boot on, and they said he had to stay downstairs for 7 weeks, non-weight bearing. And he sat in the recliner chair, and he slept in the recliner chair. Ooh. There was only myself and my husband.
Yeah.
I was doing the lot. I was toileting him.
Of course, the big problem we've got here is that if you've broken both of the bones in your ankle, that's the tibia and the fibula. The tibia is the big one and the fibula is the little one. Then you've got no stability at all. In order for those to fix, you have to be completely non-weight bearing. But the issue we have is that in order to be non-weight bearing, you would have to be using crutches. And if you haven't got enough muscle strength to use those, then of course you end up sitting in a chair, as we heard with Jill.
But thank you, Jill, for your call. Is there, if somebody says non-weight bearing, that doesn't necessarily mean you just sit in a chair?
No, absolutely not. Non-weight bearing on that leg.
Right, because you can still dance with one leg.
Absolutely. So you would stand with one leg up, and if you use crutches, then of course you can end up with very good strength.
Yeah.
So I'm just standing up and demonstrating.
You are doing
I
that
went
really
a little bit far away from the microphone.
But Jill, thank you, and good luck to your husband, who I gather is still having physio because of all the wastage.
Good luck.
So we're talking about PJ paralysis, such an interesting subject. Tony texts, a year ago I was very ill. I was in a coma for 6 weeks and I lost over 2 stone. I then was eventually discharged with a Zimmer frame. I had to work really hard to regain a level of fitness.
Absolutely. And of course, again, as we've said, those muscle fibres being replaced with fat. So each fibre that is still there is just as strong, but the problem is there aren't as many of them, so everything feels just floppy.
Fiona in Glasgow says, this item is making me so angry. Last year, my dad, who's 86, was in hospital for 3 weeks. During most of that time, he was kept in bed with the medical staff at the sides of the bed up, and it was noticeable at the time how much confidence he'd lost. Even now, over a year later, he's not recovered back to where he was before he went into hospital. The hospital's idea was to send him to another hospital to learn to walk again. We suggested physio at home, which he was given, but it seems he was kept in bed to avoid potential of claims rather than what was good for him.
Well, of course, this is a real issue. If there aren't enough staff, as Karen highlighted, then can you keep somebody safe? And of course, in an ideal world, there would be 2 members of nursing staff or 2 members of physiotherapy staff to every patient so that every time they needed to get out, they could get out. But of course, we simply do not have enough staff in the NHS. And I think it's very sad because this is by so means not the first time I've heard this, Fiona. You've kept somebody in bed with the sides up because they're at risk of falls, because you know that they could fall over and fall out. But the problem with that is if you've got staff who are overworked on the wards, they're doing their very best, but they've got too many patients, they're doing the feeding, they're doing the changing, they're doing the drug rounds, it can be really difficult to find. And we need to stop this happening.
Yeah, Lisa Ruddin in Manchester. This is your mother-in-law, Lisa.
It is, yes.
So she's in hospital now?
She is. She's in the MRI at the moment. And she has received good care and everything, Jeremy, but our problem is that we're desperate to get her home. And she was medically discharged 10 days ago, but because social services haven't been out to see what they have to provide and able to make it safe at home for her, and we've been chasing them every day to try and get them to do this. She's now been in a hospital bed on a high dependency ward for the last 10 days, and we can't get her mobile. The only time she manages to get around is when anybody visits.
And as we're saying today, Sarah, the clock is counting down because the more time she spends in the bed, the harder it is to get her out.
The harder it is to get her out. And of course, the good news is that she is having a social services assessment at home to make sure that if the occupational therapist needs to come in and make home adaptations, if the physiotherapist needs to come in, if things need to be changed in the house to make it safe for her, that's going to happen. Well, that's great news because it didn't used to happen some years ago.
It's just not happening quick enough because she's now been medically discharged for 10 days. This is the second time that she's been in hospital in the last 6 weeks. She first had a hip replaced 6 weeks ago. So this assessment should have happened a long time ago. Yeah. Because she was kept in hospital then too long the first time, she's very unstable when she came out, and she then fell and then dislocated the hip for a second time, so which she's now had to be readmitted for. And she's perfectly well within herself. She's wanting to get up and about and get out of the pyjamas.
Yeah.
She's getting depressed. She's been kept in hospital for 10 days longer than she has to.
Yeah, well, we hadn't even got on to
to get her home.
Yeah, we hadn't got on to the psychological consequences. Of course, it has such a dreadful impact on your self-esteem. So many older people, and indeed people of every age, want to be independent. But isn't it interesting? We heard that she was in hospital for too long. What the reasons were, we don't know. There may have been good medical reasons for that. But when she came out, she immediately was at risk of falls.
Yeah. So the stat we started off with, over the age of 80, 10 days in hospital equals 10 years of muscle wastage. Terry Westwood in Bourne, Lincolnshire, says, I was in hospital last October. In 10 days, I lost 6 kilos. I was a healthy pensioner, but my fitness level diminished hugely when I came out, and I'm just finding it hard to get back to my old self.
Yeah. Well, the good news, Terry, if you were previously fit and you're now independent, you can work your way up gently. I don't know if you've had physiotherapy, but if you have, they should have given you exercises. Please keep doing them. Please stick with it. But of course, keep yourself safe.
Joanne emails from Dorset, and this maybe shows that things are changing in the 21st century. She's younger. I had major bowel surgery to remove a cancerous tumour 2 years ago. I was back on the ward after a 5-hour operation at 7 o'clock that evening, and by 9:30 the next morning, 2 physios had me up up and about, walking up and down the ward. One carried the bags, the drips, the drains, and the other held my hand. And it's called the Enhanced Recovery Programme, and it worked for me.
It absolutely does. It was exactly what I referred to. I didn't speak specifically about the Enhanced Recovery Programme. That's younger people who are physically fit because they will try and get you home, sometimes within 2 or 3 days after having a hip replacement, for instance. But of course, it's so important that we then extend this to people who are less able or less physically fit, because if you've had a major knee procedure and major hip procedure, the physios will be there. Trouble is, there's just not enough of them.
Dr Sarah Jarvis, happy Bank Holiday Monday.
And you.
Thank you so much. So interesting. And thanks Karen Rogers as well, who's talking to us from Worcester. Her campaign is called EndPJparalysis. You can look it up, hashtag EndPJparalysis, and you heard all about it. Very interesting. I hope it doesn't affect your family.